Hi everyone. So for this first video for the second week that we're talking about David Hume, I really want to focus on one aspect of Hume's argument against causality, or at least for a skeptical understanding of causality. And so it's going to be a little bit of recap, but I think that it's important because I think that it can maybe it's another way of explaining Hume's argument that maybe will sort of demonstrate its force. It was really interesting seeing all of your reading responses to Hume because I think that we have like a very varied reaction among everyone. Like some people think that Hume's fork is a real problem and that has very serious implications. It means we should be skeptical about causality. Other people say, that it's not a real problem, that we don't really need to worry about it, and all sorts of different permutations of those sorts of responses. So I think that that's great. It really shows that we have a really diverse group of thinkers, and so I think that the fact that Hume can sort of provoke that response out of us is really powerful. And so I want to try to keep some of that, but I also want to try to, as much as possible, at least, while we're doing the Hume weeks, do my best to try to make sure that Hume's arguments seem as powerful and as gripping as they can possibly be. And it's also kind of important because soon we're going to be talking about Immanuel Kant. And Kant, in many ways, takes on a lot of the aspects of Hume's skepticism and sort of tries to answer them. And so, in a lot of ways, that the previous philosophy that we've read has in various ways been a response to Descartes. You might think that Kant is going to give sort of a response to Hume, where he really takes on Hume's skeptical problems and tries to give something other than Hume's skeptical conclusion. So we're going to focus mostly on recap, but we're also going to talk a little bit about section 6 about probability, so that the remaining videos can be about section 7 through 9. Okay. Oh, also, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but also there is a rubric for your final paper that is available on Learn. Hopefully by now you've seen the announcements that explains all of this information. It hopefully is self-explanatory, but please let me know if you have any questions. All you need to do is reach out via email and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If for whatever reason I don't get back to you right away, feel free to email me again. Maybe I missed it or something. But I try to be as responsive as possible. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. It should give you plenty of time to be able to do the extra credit assignment, which is included in the rubric. You should be able to see all the information about that. You should have enough time to be able to do all that stuff. You basically have all of November. So yeah, let me know if you have any sort of questions. Anyway, diving back into Hume. So mostly we're going to give a recap about causality and talking about Hume's fork a little bit. I think that we all sort of agree that Hume's arguments against an interpretation of causality as a relation of ideas is mostly dead in the water. That Hume's arguments are very, very powerful against this sort of position. That there's no real way to rationally deduce an effect from its cause. That perhaps God or something like that has that sort of power or ability, but we definitely don't, right? So what that means is that we have to think about causal relations as evidenced by experience. And really you're going to see that in Hume's general method, always his approach is going to be to trace thoughts back to their original sensation. And this is the key, I think, for Hume and in empiricist philosophy generally, for sort of not falling into what they see as the trappings of rationalist philosophy. the rationalist philosophy wanted to begin from concepts or thoughts like substance or God or something like that, right? That which is maybe the least clear to us, and then proceed to use that to ground our knowledge, when really we should have been grounding our knowledge from the things that we understand and know most, which are the sensations that we have from experience, right? And so we're always going to be tracing our thoughts back to their original sensations. That was the sort of drive in the treatise, Hume's analysis of selfhood, is that he really wanted to try to say, okay, we have a lot of conceptions of selfhood, right? Descartes thought about the self as an intellectual substance, so like a soul that cannot be divided, right? Leibniz thought about substance, or thought about the soul as a monad, personal idea, identity as a monad, right? Um, and for Hume, both of these conceptions, we don't, if we're going to follow this method of tracing our thoughts back to our original sensations, there is no original sensation of substance, right? Intellectual or otherwise. All we have are the sensations that we receive from the external world and our reflections about those sensations, right? And so if we don't have any ability to trace the thoughts back to their original sensations, then there's no content, right? It doesn't have any direct applicability to our lives, and so the disputes about them can never be more than purely verbal disputes. And so Hume sees sort of the debate between, you might see between like Cartesians and Spinozists and Leibnizians about the nature of the soul. And the way that Hume responded to that is just to say that it's completely fake. That it's a completely verbal dispute. It's not about really the nature of the soul. It's about their different conceptions of this vocabulary and how they relate to each other. And so that's sort of Hume's bent against rationalist philosophy, is that it deals with thoughts, right? Thoughts that have no correlate to sensation, no empirical correlate. They have no relation to our experience. And so part of Hume's argument for why, even if we try an inductive proof for causality, that it doesn't work. In other words, Hume wants to say that our inductive inferences actually rely on causal relations, right? They don't justify causal relations, they presume them, right? And I think that maybe chopping it out this way has a better chance of explaining why this is the case. So in any inductive inference, so inductive inferences are like inferences about what the future is going to be like based on what the past has been like, right? Every time I've read a Hume book, I've really liked it, so I'll probably like the next Hume book that I read, right? This is a sort of inference that works this way. And so Hume wants to say that inductive inferences have three parts, right? So premise one, and this isn't exactly a syllogism, but that's not important for now. So premise one, it has been this way, right? And so the first part of the inference that I did is my example that I've liked every Hume book, right? The first part is I have liked every Hume book, right, that I read so far. So it's a claim about the nature of the past, right? And then premise two, this is ultimately the premise that Hume is trying to investigate in his analysis. This premise is the future will resemble the past. So importantly, what premise 2 does is it takes the force of premise 1, which was previously only about the past, and it says that we can reasonably expect both the present and the future to resemble this past, right? So it's not only that I've liked every Hume book, it's also that from this I can infer that I probably will like Hume books in the future. And so the conclusion that I make based on this inference is that I will probably, like the next Hume book that I read, right? And so Hume is trying to point out that inductive inferences, inferences based on experience, always contain these three parts, these two premises and this conclusion, right? Why do these premises have to be different? Well, because premise one is all about the past, right? And it's possible we have instances where we have new experiences that break with what has happened in the past, right? So like maybe I've only seen red fire up to this point, and in one point, and so I make the inference that all fire is red, right? Using this same schema, but then I come across a fire that's so hot that it's blue, right? Then in this case, premise one, it has been this way, right? The fact that I have seen only red fire, that's still true. But premise two, that the future will resemble the past, that premise actually turned out to be false in this case, right? Instances where we have experiences that break our expectations, right? It seems like premise one is true, but premise two is false. And that's why the conclusion, didn't hold in that case, right? And so Hume's skeptical inquiry is about this premise, premise two that I've written in pink. This premise is about why it is that we think that events that happened in the past will continue to happen in the future, right? And so I've written one rebuttal that you might have is you might say, like, look, Hume, the fact that the future will resemble the past, the reason why that's the case is because it's totally reliable, right? It's always been this way, right? But ultimately, Hume says this response is circular. Why is this response circular? Because in using an inductive argument, it contains three parts, right? It has premise one, which is the correlate of this in the general schema. Premise one, the future has resembled the past. So here, you can take maybe the experiences that are the most constant in your life. So, I think that the sun rising, right? The sun has risen every day for all of us, right? I mean, eclipses and whatnot notwithstanding, right? So this is pretty reliable, right? So we can substitute that as our first premise, right? And then we use premise two, that the future will resemble the past, and then we get conclusion that the future will resemble the past. So the reason why Hume says that the argument is circular is because you're trying to prove this, that the future will resemble the past. But any inductive argument contains, as an essential part of it, as one of its premises, that the future will resemble the past. So you can't actually prove that the future will resemble the past using an inductive argument because all inductive arguments presume it, right? This is Hume's point. This is why Hume says ultimately that premise 2 is sort of special. Why is premise 2 special? Because it's not a rational justification, right? Like normally we think of only reasons as existing in these premises, right? But Hume wants to say that we will expect that the future will resemble the past as an anthropological fact, as a cultural fact. It is something. It's a fact about human beings that we do expect the future to resemble the past. But unlike other things that we would put in an argument, this isn't something that's rationally justified. It's not something that we do metaphysics and learn, and it's not something that we learn either through experience. It's something that is part for Hume of human nature. And this is his skeptical solution to the problem. The problem is that this doesn't have any rational justification, this premise. Hume's skeptical solution is to say that even if it doesn't hold as a rational inference that holds practically, right? That we, even if like when we do our logic chopping as philosophers, we find it faulty, it's nevertheless true that like as just a feature about human beings, a psychological feature, an anthropological feature, that we do carry this expectation, and that this expectation is essential to our conduct. And so the fact that it isn't fully rationally justified is just fine. It just means, it just limits the scope of our inquiry, what it is that we can do with our reason, right? If this inference isn't justified rationally, then there are important limits to rational justification, to the sort of things that we can effectively philosophize about. And that's going to be the subject of the next couple of sections. But I hope that you found this recap helpful.